After Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, it was a 25-year-old Nisei, Thomas Kunito Shoyama, and a 29-year-old fluently bilingual Kibe, Kunio Shimizu, who would emerge as leaders of the Japanese-Canadian Citizens Council, a newly formed organization representing 53 Nisei organizations. Both graduated from the University of British Columbia in 1938, and both worked for the New Canadian newspaper. After Japan's surrender in 1945, at the urging of the British government, 51 Canadian Nisei, including Shimizu and Shoyama, were recruited to act as translators for military intelligence in Southeast Asia. However, in 1942, both were viewed as the enemy. The report on Japanese activities in British Columbia listed Shoyama and Shimizu as suspects, number 13 and 68, respectively, and Shoyama was singled out as one of the most dangerous influences among the Japanese in British Columbia. According to Anne Sunahara, in early 1942, Shoyama and Shimizu began agitating for greater Nisei participation in the affairs of the Japanese community. They attempted to wrest control from the Japanese Liaison Committee, chaired by Etsuji Mori, which served as the sole intermediary between the Japanese-Canadian community and the BC Security Commission. The committee was responsible for ensuring community compliance with government orders and maintaining order during the uprooting. Even more troubling was that with little intelligence of their own, the police relied heavily on information from Mori, a Japanese gangster who had been acquitted of murder in the 1920s, and maintained a cozy relationship with the police. By April 1942, Mori's influence had collapsed under mounting community opposition. With the leadership vacuum created by the Canadian government's attempt to silence the Japanese-Canadian community by arresting 40 prominent Issei leaders within days of Pearl Harbor, sending any male who resisted or protested to a prisoner of war camp, and exacerbated by a language barrier for many of the remaining Issei, the two Nisei, Shoyama and Shimizu, emerged as the community's primary spokesman. Responding to the incessant demands of BC's racist politicians calling for internment or deportation, and increasingly biased media, the lack of support from Canadian citizens and their churches, the big lie about Japanese spies, sabotage, and fifth column activity in British Columbia, and the very real fear of what Roosevelt and the Americans might do, Shoyama and Shimizu urged calm and cooperation. As the General Secretary of the Japanese-Canadian Citizens Committee, Shimizu sincerely believed that temporary separation was inevitable and appealed to the Canadian-born Nisei to cooperate with the government, evacuate in an orderly manner, and be a credit to our people. Even the New Canadian, the voice of the Nisei, and the only Japanese-Canadian newspaper permitted to publish during the war, advocated complete and unswerving loyalty to the country that has given us birth, protection, and sustenance. Shimizu and Shoyama's strategy of cooperation and calm did not play into the hands of the racists and fearmongers. Their strategy protected Japanese Canadians from greater harm and built a relationship of tolerance and, in some instances, trust. It also gave Shoyama and the New Canadian the standing to keep a fractured community together and to advocate for them while resisting government injustice. During World War II, military training was compulsory for all male students at the University of British Columbia. 6 to 10 hours per week. The university was preparing to send every available soldier to the country's service if the need arose. The men were given rigorous and extensive military training. 19-year-old Mits Sumiya, a member of the Canadian Officers Training Corps, and 59 other Japanese-Canadian students at UBC were ready to fight for Canada.
We swore our allegiance to the Crown, which was a king at the time, saying that we will be loyal to the Canada and to the British Crown. Quite set, I think all of us were quite set on going to war on behalf of Canada, because this was our country.
And yet, shortly after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, all 60 students of Japanese ancestry were discharged from the officers' training program.
And all of a sudden, we're told we're kicked out. And it was a shock.
The UBC student newspaper reported that for the past year and a half, the Japanese-Canadian students have drilled with their friends of the white race. Now, it has ended. UBC President Dr. Leonard Klink was quoted as saying that the sight of a Japanese in uniform would be unfortunate and might have serious consequences for them. The students responded, "We are loyal. We want to take our place by the side of our Canadian friends in the defense of Canada." On February 7, 1942, all males of Japanese racial origin were ordered from the 100-mile restricted zone and sent to work in forced labor camps.
When they told me I had to go to road camp, I said, no, I'm not going to road camp. First of all, I said, I'm Canadian-born. I've sworn my allegiance to the Crown. I see no reason why I have to move from the coast. But I certainly am not going to road camp because I consider that as a slave labor camp.
For his refusal, and without ever being charged or convicted of a crime, Canadian-born Mitsumiya would spend the next 4 years in a prisoner of war camp in eastern Ontario. The NISEI Mass Evacuation Group was a group of NISEI, Canadian-born Japanese Canadians, who shared one common purpose: to protest the federal government's policy of separating families by sending all males of Japanese racial origin to forced labor camps. One of the leaders of the group, 31-year-old Fujikazu Tanaka, lived in a comfortable home in East Vancouver with his wife, Meiko, and their 3 children, Joe, Emmy, and Reiko. Fuji graduated from the University of British Columbia in 1937 with a Bachelor of Arts degree and had been a proud member of the Canadian Officers Training Corps. In 1934, Tanaka appeared on CJOR radio to counter the agitation and propaganda of a white supremacist organization, the Native Sons of BC, who were opposed to giving Japanese Canadians the vote. He owned a successful insurance agency at 415 Powell Street in Vancouver. If you look carefully, you can see an advertisement in the window to buy victory bonds. The other leader, Yukio Bob Shimoda, was a 27-year-old bachelor who was born and raised in Port Moody. He and his 7 siblings lived with their parents in a shack behind the Royal Bank Building on Clark Street. The Great Depression forced Bob to quit school when he was 14 to work at the Thurston Flavel Lumber Company with his father and brothers. For many, joining the NISEI Mass Evacuation Group was a family affair. Shimoda and his 2 brothers, Mitsugo and Haruo, and his future brother-in-law, Tameo Kanbara, were all members of the group. Like Shimoda, 2 of the first to join the group, brothers Robert and Masatoshi Okazaki, had an aging father, Nobutaro, who was 62 years old. The brothers refused to abandon their elderly father. Tanaka and Shimoda were both members of the Japanese Canadian Citizens Council and were forced to resign in April 1942 for their outspoken views, which were deemed contrary to the best interests of the council. The very next day, Tanaka and Shimoda met with the British Columbia Security Commission, the federal government agency responsible for organizing and implementing the forced removal of Japanese Canadians, and presented a plan for relocation in family groups to Austin Taylor and RCMP Assistant Commissioner Frederick Meade. Taylor, chairman of the British Columbia Security Commission, was a wealthy mining executive who lived in one of Vancouver's most expensive homes and raised horses as a hobby. One of his horses, Indian Broom, placed third in the 1936 Kentucky Derby. Shimoda wrote about the meeting and his perceptions of Taylor and Meade in his diary.
Taylor is cold-hearted, just doing a job, and has no intention of listening to any workable plan. He has no love for his fellow man. Meade's a shyster, a two-faced hypocrite. He cannot be trusted. Both are smart in a crooked way, but not exceptionally so. They tried to scare us into submission by threats, hemmed and hawed and said no.
Later that same day, Shimoda and Tanaka made their proposal to Austin Taylor public.
We have said yes to all your previous orders, however unreasonable they might have seemed. But we are firm in saying no to your last order, which calls for the breakup of our families.
Over the next few weeks, typewritten pamphlets and posters from the NISEI mass evacuation group seemed to appear everywhere and were being investigated by the police. The group posted a letter on April 22, 1942, accusing the New Canadian newspaper, The Voice of the Second Generation, of becoming the voice of the Security Commission. While the purpose of the NISEI mass evacuation group remained the preservation of families, the group was critical of anything that jeopardized the safety and security of Japanese Canadians. On April 27, 1942, they reported on the conditions at Hastings Park. Their investigation disclosed, amongst other things, that the quality and quantity of food was insufficient. They also reported on the impact of gambling at Hastings Park. School children are imitating, and women and children are suffering. On May 5th, they published a letter from the men at the DuQuoin work camp, stating that after paying for room and board, medical unemployment insurance, and family maintenance, the men in the road camps were only earning $5.62 per month. On May 8th, they criticized the self-supporting camps, where only the rich were evacuated in family groups. On May 20th, they reported that Japanese Canadians in the ghost towns were living and sleeping in poor and crowded living quarters, sometimes 8 persons to a small room. Accommodation was often worse than the most dilapidated hotels. Cost of living was more expensive than Vancouver, and relief was difficult to get. Any male who protested or resisted was arrested by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and jailed in the Vancouver Immigration Building at the foot of Burrard Street. Accessible by both train and ship, the Immigration Building was the first point of departure for all Japanese Canadians being forcibly removed from the coast. It would also be the last point of departure for the 4,000 men, women, and children deported to Japan in 1946. Mitsumiya was jailed for a month and a half in the Immigration Building, wearing the same clothes he arrived in and given no access to shower facilities. He shared a large single room with 60 or 70 men who were forced to sleep on mattresses strewn all over the floor. They were provided with only 2 meals a day, both unnourishing and insufficient. In his book, The NISEI Mass Evacuation Group and POW Camp 101, Robert Okazaki says he lost 27 pounds in only 3 weeks. On April 24, 1942, 105 Japanese Canadian prisoners incarcerated in the Vancouver Immigration Building were shipped to a remote prisoner of war camp in eastern Canada, over 4,000 kilometers away. The majority would remain there for more than 4 years. In protest and in solidarity, Eizo Ono, Robert Okazaki, and 64 other members of the NISEI mass evacuation group demanded to be let into the immigration building to join their comrades. When ordered to disperse by soldiers in full battle gear, bayonets mounted at the ready, the men sat down peacefully until they were allowed in and locked up. As bad as the conditions were, it was not until the authorities stopped allowing friends and relatives to carry on conversations from the street, prisoners shouting back from the open windows above, that the men reached their breaking point. On May 13, 1942, 130 prisoners broke windows, hurled toilet paper and rubbish out of the windows, and sprayed a fire hose onto the guards below. The disturbance only lasted 2 hours, but the damage was considerable. The following day, the prisoners were put to work cleaning up their mess, and attempts were made, unsuccessfully, to force the men to pay for all the damage. Fujikazu Tanaka was number 35 of 208 Japanese-Canadian suspects listed in the report on Japanese-Canadian activities in British Columbia. Labeled an agitator, the report blamed him for the riot, even though he wasn't there. Austin Taylor downplayed the disturbance.
Some of the Japanese just got a little fed up about being kept in the building. There was nothing malicious about the trouble. It was more playful than anything else.
Taylor's attempt to downplay the disturbance made good news copy, nationally and internationally. The Nanaimo Daily News reported that the government failed to see the joke. In fact, the riot was deeply troubling for the government and resulted in the NISEI mass evacuation group being invited to negotiate with the Security Commission. Ken Adachi suggested that it was probably the program of defiance, not the policy of compliance, that led to the speedy reunification of families 6 weeks later.